Imagine spending nearly 40 years in solitary confinement. That's the reality for Jeff Fort, the once powerful leader of Chicago's El Rucken gang, who masterminded plots of terror from inside a federal prison. Jeff Fort, the notorious former leader of Chicago's infamous El Rucken Street gang, recently faced another setback in his quest for freedom. At 76 years old, he has spent nearly 4 decades confined in a federal supermax prison, living in what is essentially solitary confinement. His latest attempt to gain release came through an appeal under the First Step Act, which gives federal judges the authority to grant compassionate release for prisoners who are elderly or suffering from significant health issues. However, his plea for leniency was denied, leaving him to continue serving an 80-year sentence imposed in 1986 for his role in conspiring to commit acts of terrorism on U.S. soil. Fort's long journey from the streets of Chicago to a high-security prison cell began in the late 1980s when he was at the peak of his criminal influence. As a powerful gang leader, he had solidified his status as one of the most dangerous men in the city, with a reputation for ruthless violence and illegal activity. His criminal empire took a shocking turn when, from behind bars, he orchestrated a plot to bomb U.S. buildings in exchange for a $2 million payment from Muammar Gaddafi, the then Libyan dictator. Even while incarcerated in a Texas federal prison on drug trafficking charges, Fort maintained control over his organization, issuing orders to his lieutenants through frequent collect calls back to the gang's Chicago base. In his handwritten appeal earlier this year, Fort portrayed himself as a frail grandfather, longing to reunite with his family after decades of separation. He highlighted the toll that his prolonged incarceration has taken, noting that many of his close relatives have passed away during his time behind bars. "Much of my immediate family is deceased," he wrote in block letters, adding that he hoped to reconnect with his surviving children and establish relationships with his grandchildren, who were born during his imprisonment. His request was an effort to demonstrate that he no longer posed a threat to society and was seeking the chance to spend his remaining years surrounded by loved ones. Nevertheless, U.S. District Judge John Tharp rejected Fort's petition, emphasizing that the original sentence was warranted due to the severity of his crimes. The judge pointed out that Fort had not only orchestrated the terrorism plot while already serving a prison term for drug offenses, but he also continued to exert control over his gang's criminal activities from behind bars. The evidence presented during his trial painted a picture of a man who, despite being incarcerated, remained deeply embedded in violent and illegal operations. Consequently, the court saw no reason to grant leniency to a figure who had once been willing to resort to terrorism for financial gain. Jeff Fort has endured the vast majority of his lengthy prison sentence in near isolation, confined within the walls of the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. His existence there is one of extreme restriction, with almost no interaction with other inmates or the outside world. His communications are tightly controlled, limited to phone calls only with his legal representatives or immediate family members, and even those calls require special permission from prosecutors. The terms of his confinement reflect the gravity of his past actions and the authorities' ongoing concern about his potential influence. U.S. District Judge John Tharp, in considering Fort's recent appeal, made it clear that there was no justification for altering the conditions of his incarceration. He described Fort as a figure whose past willingness to kill for profit and without regard for human life placed him among the most dangerous criminals in the justice system. Tharp concluded that granting any form of sentence reduction would be entirely inappropriate given the seriousness of Fort's offenses. Fort's history shows a level of danger that cannot be overlooked, the judge wrote, emphasizing that the original sentencing intended to address not just the acts he committed but the broader threat he posed to society. While Fort's supporters pointed to his good behavior in prison, including his participation in various educational programs, Judge Tharp was not swayed. He acknowledged these positive efforts but deemed them insufficient to demonstrate that the once ruthless El Rucken leader, who was known as Imam among his followers, had transformed into a benign and harmless elderly man who merely sought to spend his twilight years with family. According to Tharp, such a transformation was far from convincingly proven, leaving little room to believe that Fort's release would be in the public's best interest. The judge went so far as to describe Fort's quest for freedom as quixotic, a term suggesting it was not just impractical but fundamentally unrealistic given the circumstances. For Fort to even have a chance at securing his release, he would need to find a way to also reduce the 75-year sentence that was handed down by a state court for ordering the murder of a rival drug dealer back in 1981. That additional sentence only compounded the legal obstacles standing between him and a life outside prison walls. The decision was a blow to Fort's family, particularly his daughter, Amina Matthews, a prominent activist who has been advocating for her father's early release. While she expressed disappointment at the outcome, she was not entirely surprised. Matthews has vowed to continue pursuing her father's freedom, despite the setbacks. "My first priority is to reestablish communication with my father and make sure he is okay," she told the Sun-Times, highlighting the emotional strain that the prolonged separation has caused. Adding to the difficulties of maintaining contact has been the COVID-19 pandemic, which further compounded the isolation enforced by the already stringent Supermax restrictions. Matthews noted that it had been several years since she last spoke with her father, due to the combined effects of these circumstances. Amina Matthews, daughter of Jeff Fort, passionately argues that her father, despite his notorious past, has the potential to be a positive force in the communities that once fell under his influence. She describes him as not just a former gang leader but as a charismatic educator who could play a crucial role in addressing the persistent violence plaguing Chicago's South and West Side neighborhoods. Matthews believes that if Fort were released, he could help to reduce the cycle of violence and gunfire in these predominantly African American communities. "He was an educator. He is an educator. He is still alive," she emphasized, conveying a sense of urgency about the contributions he could still make. Fort's reputation once stood on par with other infamous figures in Chicago's gang landscape, such as Larry Hoover, founder of the Gangster Disciples. Both men were powerful and feared during their heyday, commanding street organizations that wielded significant influence over the city's criminal underworld. The paths of these two notorious figures have converged again, as they now find themselves incarcerated in the same federal Supermax prison. However, while Hoover continues to maintain a degree of public visibility even from behind bars, Fort's presence has largely receded from the public eye, making him a nearly forgotten figure outside of his family and closest supporters. In the 1960s, both Fort and Hoover sought to give their street organizations a veneer of legitimacy, presenting them as community-oriented groups that aimed to uplift African American neighborhoods through educational and social programs. Fort, in particular, portrayed the Black P. Stone Nation not just as a gang but as a community organization with aspirations to improve the lives of the city's youth. Their efforts at times garnered support from some of the nation's most prestigious philanthropic institutions, which provided funding for programs that appeared to benefit the local communities. However, the violent reality behind these efforts eventually overshadowed any philanthropic facade, as the true nature of their organizations came to light. The 1980s and 1990s marked a period of escalating gang violence in Chicago, with record-high murder rates that coincided with the peak influence of figures like Fort and Hoover. The city's streets became battlegrounds, and their organizations were at the center of much of the bloodshed. The public perception of Fort shifted drastically from that of a potential community leader to that of a dangerous criminal whose impact on society was undeniably destructive. This shift was cemented by Fort's high-profile criminal cases, including his conviction for orchestrating acts of terrorism and his connections to other illegal enterprises. Now, decades later, both Fort and Hoover are seeking to shorten their lengthy sentences by appealing to the federal judiciary under the First Step Act, a piece of legislation passed in 2018 that enables judges to reconsider sentences for elderly or ailing inmates who have served significant portions of their time. The act allows for compassionate release, a possibility that Fort's legal team has pursued, arguing that he has changed during his nearly 40 years in prison and no longer represents the threat he once did. Matthews and other advocates contend that Fort's rehabilitation is genuine and that his release could be a step toward healing the very communities that suffered during the height of his criminal activity. The question remains whether the courts will be persuaded that a man who once had a hand in shaping Chicago's history of gang violence can now help to reverse its effects. For Fort, who has spent most of his life behind bars, the pursuit of freedom is more than just a legal battle. It is a struggle to redefine his legacy, from that of a feared gang leader to a potentially redemptive figure who could guide a new generation away from the path he once walked. Larry Hoover's quest for freedom has gained some high-profile support in recent years. In 2021, Chicago native Ye, formerly Kanye West, and his then-wife Kim Kardashian made a significant effort to secure a pardon for Hoover, carrying the plea directly to President Donald Trump. Their advocacy for Hoover extended beyond political appeals. Ye even hosted a benefit concert at the Los Angeles Coliseum, which was a sold-out event co-headlined by rap superstar Drake. Despite this attention and star-studded backing, Hoover's plea for leniency was ultimately denied that same year. Nevertheless, his legal team has not given up and continues to push for the judge to reconsider his case. Even if Hoover manages to secure a release from federal custody, he still faces a state prison term that he must complete. Hoover's legal representation has included prominent attorneys such as Jennifer Bonjean, whose notable clients have included controversial figures like Bill Cosby and R. F. Kelly. The resources and connections available to Hoover's legal team stand in stark contrast to the situation of Jeff Fort, who has struggled for decades to find attorneys willing to take on his case. According to his daughter, Amina Matthews, Fort has been largely on his own in his fight for freedom. Earlier this year, he even took matters into his own hands, drafting his own petition for compassionate release. Additionally, he submitted a separate request asking the judge to permit another inmate at the Supermax facility, someone serving a 40-year term for sexually assaulting prisoners in an Alaskan federal prison, to assist him with future legal filings. Fort's situation at the federal Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, has been described by his daughter as being under the mountain. The facility houses some of the most infamous criminals in the United States, including Oklahoma City bomber Terry Nichols, mob boss James Marcello, and 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui. Under the stringent conditions of his confinement, Fort has endured years of extreme isolation, with only attorneys or immediate family members permitted to visit him. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19 lockdown measures, no one has been able to visit Fort since before the pandemic began, further limiting his contact with the outside world. Despite these hardships, Fort did make some progress in his fight for a more lenient prison life. Prison officials recognized that he met certain criteria for compassionate release based on factors such as his age and health. However, his petition was ultimately denied, with authorities citing the nature of his criminal charges and his leadership role in the El Runcan gang as grounds for rejecting his request. Nevertheless, there have been small changes in his confinement conditions. Matthews noted that Fort was granted slightly more freedom of movement within the prison, as well as expanded access to phone calls. These adjustments, though limited, allowed Fort to begin seeking help from other inmates who could assist him with his legal filings. Matthews described her father's incremental gains as a result of his efforts to navigate the complexities of the prison system with little outside help. When he was able to move around a little, that's when he was able to get someone to help him, she explained. The plan that ultimately brought down Jeff Fort and the El Runcan gang was far from the usual criminal activities typically associated with Chicago's street gangs. Initially, the federal investigation into Fort's organization focused on standard drug trafficking operations, routine work for the FBI and local law enforcement involved. However, when agents tapped the phones at the gang's headquarters, known as the Fort, a fortified former theater on the south side of Chicago, they were stunned by what they discovered. Fort, who was already serving a drug trafficking sentence in a Texas federal prison, was not just managing his gang's drug trade and violent activities from behind bars. He was also orchestrating an audacious plot involving acts of terrorism on U.S. soil in exchange for a $2.5 million payment from Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. The scheme was exposed during a period of heightened tensions between the U.S. and Libya. Gaddafi's regime was known for secretly supporting various militant groups, including those in Palestine and even Northern Ireland. Fort's indictment in 1986 came only weeks after President Ronald Reagan had ordered airstrikes against Libya in retaliation for Gaddafi's suspected involvement in a bombing at a Berlin nightclub frequented by U.S. military personnel. Amid this global context, Fort's plan took shape, revealing a disturbing link between the El Rukn gang and international terrorism. While Fort had embraced Islam and infused the gang's message with elements of the Muslim faith, authorities suspected that the religious turn was at least partly a strategic move to make it harder for law enforcement to obtain search warrants and wiretaps. Former federal prosecutor Patrick Deedy, who was instrumental in building the case against the El Rukns, expressed doubts that the gang's motivations were rooted in any genuine ideological or religious commitment. Instead, he suggested that Fort was driven by envy of the $5 million that Gaddafi had reportedly paid to another prominent Chicago figure, Louis Farrakhan, and the Nation of Islam. To secure his own share of Libyan money, Fort dispatched emissaries to hold meetings with Libyan officials, not only in Libya but also at a Libyan embassy in Panama, where negotiations over the $2.5 million deal took place. Whether Fort truly intended to follow through with the planned terror attacks or simply wanted to swindle Gaddafi out of his money remains uncertain. However, the gang's actions suggested they were taking the plot seriously. During a sting operation, members of the El Rukns even purchased what they believed was a functional anti-tank rocket from an undercover FBI agent. The resulting criminal charges against Fort and several top lieutenants marked a historic moment in U.S. legal history, as it was the first instance in which American citizens were charged with conspiring to commit terrorism within the United States. Reflecting on the case years later, Deedy, now a private attorney, described it as pretty unbelievable, especially considering that these events took place well before the 9/11 attacks redefined the nation's understanding of domestic terrorism. This was all pre-9/11, and here we had concrete evidence of someone planning acts of terror, blowing up buildings, inside the United States, he noted. Deedy viewed the El Rukns not as politically motivated extremists, but rather as mercenaries who would have committed acts of violence if the price was right. Despite recent efforts to advocate for Fort's release, the nature of his crimes presents a significant obstacle to leniency. His case does not fit neatly into the narrative of sentencing reform, which has largely focused on reducing the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders who were harshly punished during the 1980s and 90s crackdown on crack cocaine. While the perception of drug offenses, particularly related to crack, has softened over the years, attitudes toward terrorism have only grown more severe since the events of September 11, 2001. As Richard Kling, a law professor at IIT Kent who has represented lower-level El Rukn members, explained, the public sentiment regarding terror bombings is unlikely to shift in a way that would favor Fort's release. There are some people they will never let out because of who they are and what they did, Kling remarked. Given Fort's role in plotting acts of terrorism, his case remains one of the most challenging for advocates of criminal justice reform, as his past actions continue to cast a long shadow over his prospects for freedom. For many, including those in the legal system, Jeff Fort is seen as someone who may never walk free again due to the gravity of his crimes and the enduring impact they have had on public safety and perception.